Hello, Sunlight students. We are now on chapter 17 of the Landmark History of the American People. This chapter is called Reformers and Self-Helpers. And we start with a picture on this page of Jane Addams, and she sits on a stoop with 4 children. She was a leader in the women's suffrage movement, and that was a movement that was trying to help women vote. She was also at the forefront of the fight against child labor and for the rights of individual citizens to hold their political, religious, and economic views without fear of the government. She founded Hull House in Chicago and was a co-founder of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. She won the 1931 Nobel Peace Prize, the first American woman to do so. And we're going to hear more about her, and I'm going to probably have a video up about her as well, so stay tuned. Not all the old comers were frightened. Some became reformers. Remember, the old comers are people that were the people that had been there for a really long time, right? They weren't the new people coming to our country. If the whole country had troubles, they said it was everybody's fault. If the country had too many strikes and too much crime, you could hardly blame those who had just arrived. It was mainly the fault, they said, of the Americans who had been here the longest and who had the most chance to make the country better. Who had built the cities and constructed the slums where the poor had to live? Who were the congressmen, senators, businessmen, and policemen? Not recent immigrants. And it was not the immigrants' fault if the nation was not prepared to receive them. Jane Addams, who we just saw a picture of, was one of the most remarkable of the reformers and one of the most original Americans of the age. And there's a picture here of a sewing class. Notice that the director is holding a newly arrived, deserted baby. Wow. That's crazy. We'll hear more about that. Addams was born with a deformity of the spine. It made her so sickly that after graduating from college in 1882, she had to spend 2 years in bed. Her wealthy family sent her to the best schools and colleges. She traveled abroad whenever she wished, and one day while she was in Spain, she watched a bullfight. That evening, she said she was surprised and horrified to realize she had watched 5 bulls and many more horses get killed, and it hadn't even bothered her. She suddenly decided that she was wasting her life, and she had to change. The trouble with people like her, Addams decided, was that they only allowed themselves to be caught in the snare of preparation. So let's see what that means. To become leaders, they pursued long years of education, but traditional classroom book learning kept them on the sidelines at the very time when they were most anxious to rebuild the world. Addams concluded that she and her friends needed more education, but it was a type of education they could not find in books. In June of 1888, she stopped in the poorest section of London to visit a group of Oxford and Cambridge graduates who lived in the famous Toynbee Hall. These people lived there in order to help the people of the neighborhood. Addams decided to start something like Toynbee Hall in the United States. Her plan was simple. She would settle a group of educated young men and women from well-to-do families in the poorest, most miserable city slum. Like Toynbee Hall, she would call it a settlement house. That's because the well-bred young men and women who would settle in the midst of the slum would be like the early colonial settlers. They would leave the comforts of the life which they were familiar to live. So they would leave their familiar comforts, these rich people, to live in a place that was as forbidding as the American wilderness had been to the forebears. Addams realized that the young men and women who came to live in the slum would see the struggles of the poor, and they would learn things from their experiences they could not learn from books. At the same time, the people of the slum would learn things from the settlers because they could use the settlement house as a school, a club, and a refuge. With her purpose clearly in mind, Addams acted quickly. Since she knew Chicago, she decided to do her work there. She looked for the neediest neighborhood, and she persuaded the owner of a large old house to let her have it for free. She opened her settlement house between an undertaker's parlor and a saloon. She called it Hull House, after the man who had built it for his home years before. Newcomers from all over Europe lived in the neighborhood of Hull House. Italians, Germans, Bohemians, French Canadians, etc. Addams set up a kindergarten and a boys' club for the young, and she paid special attention to the very old people whom nobody else seemed to care about. Addams displayed red roses at Hull House party. One old Italian woman was so delighted at the sight, she imagined Addams must have brought them all the way from Italy. She would not believe for an instant that they had been grown in America. Addams wrote, she said that she had lived in Chicago for 6 years and had never seen any roses, whereas in Italy she had seen them every summer in great profusion. During all that time, of course, the woman had lived within 10 blocks of a florist's window. She had not been more than a 5-cent car ride away from the public parks, but she had never dreamed of going forth for herself, and no one had taken her. Her conception of America had been the untidy street in which she lived. Hull House launched all sorts of unexpected projects. Participants founded a book bindery and a music school. The amateur Little Theater movement staged its first plays at the Hull House, and the movement eventually spread across the country. Adams' work became famous, and settlement houses on the Hull House model soon appeared in big cities everywhere. And the formerly hopeless sons and daughters of poor families suddenly found their chance to become playwrights, actors, composers, and musicians. For the first time, many thousands of these immigrants discovered that somebody else cared about them. What a cool story, huh? Jane Addams, without the aid of governments or politicians, had helped make America the promised land. And here's a picture of her right here. We've got Isabella Blaney, Mary J. Wilmarth, and Jane Addams on the far right. And they're standing together in a motor car during a parade supporting votes for women. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution gave women the right to vote, right? So we had that 12th, 13th, and 14th with the African Americans, and then we had a few in between. I don't think we've talked about all of them, but 19 gives women the right to vote on there. America had always been that land of help yourself. Before long, some of the most energetic reformers came from the immigrants, but it was not easy for newcomers to become leaders. So many respectable institutions remained in the hands of the oldcomers, people whose families had been here for a century or more. For example, Harvard College was the oldest college in the country. It was where the young blue bloods, and those are the rich people, had learned their ideas of Anglo-Saxon superiority, that we are from the elite race. And oldcomers ran the college. It was hard even to become a student there if you were not already one of them. New institutions offered the best chance for newcomers. Among the most remarkable and most American of these institutions were the scores of new colleges and universities. There were only 17 state universities when the Civil War started that we learned about. But in 1862, an energetic congressman from Vermont, his name was Justin Morrill, secured the passage of legislation that is known even today by the name the Morrill Act. The Morrill Act granted lands from the public domain to support new state colleges. So this meant we would take land that was in the public, that wasn't owned by people, and create colleges. Each state would receive 30,000 acres for each of its senators and representatives in Congress. These would be called land-grant colleges, and they would teach students how to be better farmers. After the Civil War, hundreds of other colleges and universities were also founded. And in the later years of the 1800s, some of the wealthiest go-getters gave millions of dollars to found still more institutions of higher learning. Johns Hopkins University was founded in 1876 based on a fortune left by a merchant from Baltimore. Leland Stanford, a railroad builder and former governor of California, founded Leland Stanford Junior University in memory of his son. John D. Rockefeller founded the University of Chicago in 1891. And these were just a few. There were many, many, many others. It says scores of others, right? That means many. Many of those college founders were men who themselves had never gone to college, but they shared the American faith in education. Even before the end of the century, the United States had more colleges and universities than there were in all of Western Europe, and more than could citizens in any other country. That's an odd sentence. And even before the United States had more colleges and universities than there were in all of Western Europe. I don't know what that sentence means. That's a little odd. And more than could citizens in any other country. There's some sort of error there. And more than could citizens in any other country, Americans could afford to go to college. Okay, that's a very poorly worded sentence. Americans were able to go to college much easier than citizens of other countries. There was enough money for them to go to college, and way more than in other countries. The children of poor immigrants, along with millions of other Americans, now had a better chance to rise in the world. The new labor unions also became centers of new leadership and self-help. Samuel Gompers had been born in London. He came to New York as a boy. He worked at starvation wages as a cigar maker before becoming president of his Cigar Makers Union and then the first president of the American Federation of Labor. Sidney Hillman, who came from Lithuania when he was 20, led the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, the union that did most to help the new immigrants in big city sweatshops. And remember, the big city sweatshops are the places where all the immigrants have to come and work, and they don't make very much money, and they're there for long hours, and maybe the children have to work, and old people have to work, and they didn't have a lot of rights. In politics, the support of your fellow immigrants counted for something. Crowded together in the cities, the immigrants of any one nationality found it easy to stick together to support themselves. So if you were the Germans, right, you would come together to help the one German that was there when they had a legal case or something like that. But soon, new political leaders from among the newcomers themselves began livening up City Hall and even the halls of Congress, which began to sound like a United Nations. So here's the representatives of the Italian Americans and German Americans and of the new arrivals from everywhere gave us new spice to American politics. This is Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia of New York City. He helped to increase his popularity among New Yorkers by reading the comics aloud over the radio during a newspaper strike. So that's kind of fun. One of the most colorful was the guy in the picture, Fiorello LaGuardia. His mother and father had come from Italy. Fiorello was born in New York City only 3 years after they arrived. His father, a musician, joined the army and soon became the leader of the infantry band or a military band. On an army post in Arizona in the 1880s, Fiorello saw the pioneer West. He found it a paradise for a little boy. We could ride burros. Our playground was not measured in acres or city blocks, but in miles and miles. We could do just about anything a little boy dreams of. We talked with miners and Indians. We associated with soldiers, and we learned to shoot. Even when we were so small, the gun had to be held for us by an older person. LaGuardia had his first glimpse of corruption while there, and it was something he would never forget. Men who were being paid to supply the American army with wholesome beef were supplying diseased beef instead. And they were pocketing the money. LaGuardia's father became so ill from eating diseased beef that the army discharged him from service. And a few years later, he died. No wonder Fiorello spent his life fighting corruption. For several years, LaGuardia worked at United States consulates in Eastern Europe. He learned about the problems of the immigrants in their homelands. When he returned to New York in 1906, he joined the Immigration Service on Ellis Island. That was where the Immigration Service examined newcomers before admitting them to the United States. LaGuardia knew Croatian as well as German and Italian, 4 languages, English, Croatian, German, and Italian. And while he worked as an interpreter, he learned the immigrants' troubles and the immigrants' hopes. In 1917, LaGuardia went to Congress, where he began his long, fearless career of defending the poor and of fighting corruption. He carried on this fight when he became mayor of New York City in 1934. Now he thought of the city as his family, and all of the city's problems were his. His familiar figure, topped by the broad-brimmed cowboy hat he learned to wear out in Arizona, was soon bouncing all over the city. He especially liked to be on hand at trouble spots. Whenever there was a big fire, LaGuardia somehow arrived with the fire chief. He served as mayor for 12 years, and he did more in that time to remove the blot of the slum and to brighten big city life than any New Yorker before him. Okay, and there will be some videos and some other things to watch with this, so check in.